Women's Soccer Review Podcast with Dwayne Rollins and Jonathan Tannenwald on the Sports Podcasting Network.
Welcome to the latest episode of the Women's Soccer Review here on the Sports Podcasting Network. I'm Jonathan Tannenwald of the Philadelphia Inquirer. And folks, take a deep breath with sound effects in the background, even if you want, for reasons I'll explain in a minute. We're between the end of the NWSL playoffs, the championship game won by the Washington Spirit, the first women's soccer title, professional women's soccer title for my hometown in 18 years since the Washington Freedom of Mia Hamm and Abby Wambach, the team that I grew up supporting. It's been a long time, folks. It's been a long time. It's been multiple stadiums, multiple generations of players, but Washington, which is one of the great soccer cities in the United States, as I'm sure many of you know. I don't just say that because I'm biased. I'm not the only one who thinks it. Has a women's soccer championship again, which is very cool to see. And let us hope the Spirit clean up their coaching staff, clean up their front office, clean up their ownership, and progress toward being the club the nation's capital really wants to get behind and support. On this show, we are not going to talk about the NWSL quite so directly. We are going to talk about the U.S. women's national team's recent tour of Australia. And to do that, I am very happy to welcome in somebody who I've known for a few years now, but has never been on this show. And it has long since been time that we fix that. I am not perfectly cogent grammar-wise because I'm recording late at night. And Marissa Lordanic of ESPN in Melbourne, Australia, is recording in the middle of the day, her time. It is so great to have you on. We've known each other since the 2019 World Cup was when we met. We will talk about that later because that's what she and I and some of her friends in Australia, what we all do is just sit around and reminisce because it's a pandemic and we can't travel, and what else is there to do? Marissa, it's great to have you on. Thanks for being here.
I'm stoked to be on Jonathan. As you said, we've known each other for a while. I think we've been threatening to do podcasts and things of that nature for a while now. So very, very excited that we can now have a chat.
Yeah. And Marissa, as I'm sure some of you know, is a podcaster in her own right. And I did say Marissa Lordanic of ESPN because the show that she does, the Far Post podcast, used to be independent. It is now an ESPN property, which is very cool and makes Marissa instantly very famous. Her co-hosts, some of you I'm sure already follow on Twitter. In case you don't, Sam Lewis of the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, who has been on this show before, and I'm sure will be again because I would love to ask her someday what it's like to be a colleague of Jim Maxwell. That is a reference that Marissa gets and nobody else will. And I might actually explain it in a few minutes because there is a link between Australian men's cricket and Australian women's soccer. And I will explain what it is and why it matters. And I think you all will find it rather interesting. Sam's one of the panelists. Anna Harrington of the Australian Associated Press, who I also met 2 years ago at the Women's World Cup, is another one. And Angela Christian Wilkes is the one of the four who is not, I have not met yet. Hopefully have the chance to someday when we can all get back to traveling, which God willing will be by the 23 World Cup in Australia and New Zealand. And hopefully somebody will pay to send me down there because there's no way I'm going to have the money to do it myself. Those of you who are already saving up, I don't blame you. It's going to be, if you thought France was expensive, this one's going to be for American fans a big, big, big financial hit. Let's talk about those two games first. A 3-0 U.S. win and then a 1-1 tie that Australia got the equalizer in the closing moments. You were at both games, and why don't we simply start at the fact that you were at both games? Because for us in the States, we've been going to games for a while now. You all haven't been. You know, how cool was it to get out and back into the stadium?
It was the best, and particularly for me. So I am from Melbourne, as you mentioned. So these games were up in Sydney and Newcastle. So the novelty of traveling interstate did not, it was still very fresh, very new, and very, very exciting. So it was amazing. And we had record crowds there. So it wasn't just getting to watch football in a stadium. It was getting to watch it with tens of thousands of people in there enjoying it as well. The weather was shocking, as it typically is in New South Wales. That's a little jab for any Sydney-siders listening. But as you said, just the excitement of being able to book a trip, go watch games, see people you haven't seen in a while because COVID has prevented this kind of stuff. It really was incredible. Ideally, some better results for the Matildas wouldn't have gone astray, but I think there was a lot to be taken simply from being able to go watch the games.
For those of you who are unaware of Australian geography and intercity rivalries, let me tell you, as someone who grew up in Washington, lives in Philadelphia, and have relatives in Boston, that somebody from Melbourne bashing Sydney is about like the rest of us in the Northeast bashing New York, which is to say it is always welcome. Apologies to the New Yorkers on this show, but we've had a lot more Philadelphians than New Yorkers on this show over time, as you all have figured out. And the Sydney-Melbourne rivalry is New York, Philadelphia, New York, Boston, Seattle, Portland, you name it. It is fierce in all things, and it does not stop. And I can guarantee you that Sydney would love to have a cricket stadium as big as the MCG and an international sporting event as prestigious as the Australian Open tennis. They will have to settle for having hosted the Olympics. And that stadium where Kathy Freeman once so famously lit the torch and ran on the track is where the U.S. women played in that first game. And a lot of us were excited, Marissa, to see a not necessarily young in all cases. It got called young because it was in some parts, but it was a new U.S. team for sure. And Mitch Purse is young, but has some experience. Sofia Huerta had been on the U.S. team before. A number of the players have been around in the NWSL for a little while. And they went down to Sydney, and we all thought they were going to get tested pretty hard. And in a lot of ways they were. But the Australians made one big mistake, I think. Maybe it's not a mistake. I shouldn't call it that. They too were experimenting. I think that's fair to say. Under Tony Gustafsson, their manager, who of course was Jill Ellis's top assistant when the U.S. won back-to-back World Cups in 2015 and 2019. And he started a very inexperienced center back tandem together. And it took 24 seconds of the first game for U.S. fans to start cackling maniacally, because that is what they do in situations like that. How much of a lesson was that, do you think, for this group of Australian players?
It was, you can't not take something from that, just not even the goal itself, but the immediacy with which the US scored. Like, you can't ignore that. That's not something that can just kind of be slipped under the rug. And Gustafsson was rightly, questioned. Why did you start a 17-year-old and a 19-year-old, one of which is nominally a fullback, the other one who has only played one season of W League, now A-League women's football? So it blew our tiny minds. I will say there was a bug going through the Australian camp, so that added a layer of difficulty, I suppose. And unfortunately, the injury to Alana Kennedy meant she could play very little part in this entire series, and Claire Polkinghorne was being rested as well. So it was a real combination of factors that led us to this centre-back pairing. And it was, we've spoken about it on our podcast, we've written about it, we've all kind of dissected and digested it, and it was just, it did not seem like the right choice. But I will say, to the girls' immense credit, to Jessica Nash and Courtney Nevin, I think they bounced back from that moment. I think they built themselves back into that game. I don't think they will be shaken permanently from what happened, which is really good news, not only for us as Australian fans, but for their respective careers as well. So it was tough to watch. I was in the media box, and never before have I felt the kind of the air go out of a place so quickly. And obviously 36,000 people in the stands, it fell dead silent, which you can't really, you don't get often with 36,000 people in one place. So it was a fascinating start to what was a very interesting game for the Matildas. It's been really interesting to kind of weigh up the Australian perspective with the US perspective on how these friendlies kind of unraveled and played out. So it's been super, super interesting to kind of see the fallout from both countries and how we both approached them and what we then respectively took out of them.
I'm curious, for those of us who watched it on TV and had the international pictures and whatnot, and I confess I did not watch the second game live because it kicked off at 4 a.m. here, and I just wasn't going to do that. I watched most of the first game, and I watched the highlights. That game kicked off at 11 p.m. Where I am, which was more palatable, but also during a holiday week when I was home with my parents. You know, when the veteran Americans come swaggering into somewhere, until they start running out of gas when they're old. I'm sorry, I'm not supposed to call them old, but I did it again. I'm sorry. No, anyway. You know, when the veteran Americans come in and everybody sees the U.S. program come swaggering into a World Cup or swaggering in the Olympics, we're used to it. We weren't sure what this group of U.S. players was going to be like beyond the Horans, Lavells, Sauerbruns, the veterans who were there to teach these newer players how to be. I'm curious if you could sense any of that old arrogance from this new set of American players.
Not really, barring obviously Lindsey Horan's comments pre-game where she was talking about loving shutting up the crowds with an early goal and stuff. She really took it upon herself to be like, you know what, you want someone to boot? I'm your gal, basically. And
she's the one you don't boot.
But she played the role to perfection over both games. The penalty really miffed people off down here, and even in Newcastle, the people they had found their kind of target. They were just like, don't like her, not a fan of her, but she's so good that you kind of have to respect the hustle in a kind of way. But in terms of arrogance, I suppose arrogance is not it. It was more just that experience, and you kind of spoke about it at the top in the sense that while this was an inexperienced at a national team level US squad, I wouldn't exactly call 26-year-old like Ashley Hatch. Yes, she's only made 2 or now 4, appearances for the US women's national team, but I'm not calling her young and inexperienced. She's been around the traps. She's just come off a NWSL championship, golden boot for the season and stuff. So comparing her to then, her direct opponent for most of that first half in Sydney, Jessica Nash, who I said 17 years old, has played 1 season of W League football. It's 2 very different propositions. So I don't know if arrogance is maybe the right word, but there was the kind of typical, I don't even know what the word is, but there wasn't anything completely unexpected from the US in the sense that they were still clinical. They took their chances. I know that a lot of people have said it looked a little bit disjointed from the US because at the end of the day, it was a lot of new players kind of coming together for the first time. But a lot of that was masked, and particularly for the average Australian football fan who maybe doesn't see a lot of the US, they looked good. They were scoring and they got the results. So I think that's an important factor to kind of take into consideration.
I will say this about Lindsey Horan. From the second she got the armband and the number 10 from Carly Lloyd, I think she wanted to play the villain for a few minutes here. I think she really relished that, and she knew that she was going to take that on. The urban legends you hear over time about some of the conversations behind the scenes about who says, yeah, I'll do that. I'll do it today. I'll be that one. And I think she relished it a little bit. And as I said a few minutes ago, she gets pounded in games often, as happened in these games too. But that's a player who you put the boot into at your own peril, because she will give it right back to you. Mm-hmm. As regards this Australian team, we've talked about center backs already. Some number of folks over here know about Mary Fowler because she's gotten a lot of hype. And you and I watch a lot of French football, so we watch Montpellier, so we know about Montpellier. I've heard, I'm sure a number of folks over here have also heard, especially those who watch the W League, have heard the name Kyra Cooney-Cross. She's a player who's gotten a lot of hype in Australia. Who are some of the other, you can talk about those two as well if you like, but who are some of the other young Matildas players who folks up here ought to know about?
Yeah. In terms of kind of the next emerging crop, the 2 that everyone have kind of hung their hats on are Fowler and Cooney-Cross, namely because they've been given the time this year. They played pivotal roles in the Olympics as well. So we know that they're not just young players who could show some spark. They've actually now dished it out in an Olympics, which is, major tournament football. That's what you want and need them for. But they've continued to do it throughout these friendlies and whatnot. So Fowler, people cannot speak highly enough. And it's not just fans, it's not just pundits, it's her own teammates. Anna did a whole article about it for AAP that basically she asked a whole bunch of her teammates and everyone was in agreement that best finisher in the team, Mary Fowler. And you've got Sam Kerr, arguably one of, if not the best strikers in the world, also saying that this 18-year-old kid is the best finisher in the team, bar none. So I think as Australians, we're all stoked that we have her, that she's country tied, because there was a little fight between us and the Republic of Ireland to get her name and make sure that she was wearing green and gold, not just green. But yeah, Fowler is just incredible. And the thing is, you see it more and more, and what she does is just phenomenal. And for her to break into this team in the sense that Australia is very stacked in the forward line. So for her to not be biding her time, not to just be kind of making appearances off the bench, but for her to be a genuine starter in amongst the likes of Kerr, of Raso, of Ford, it speaks volumes to her quality. And the fact that she's only 18 is just so exciting, because that's at least a decade's worth of football with her in it. So it's so exciting. Kyra Cooney-Cross, on the other hand, very different player. I have to mention that she won Melbourne Victory, the W League Championship last season, off an Olympico. And it brought me so much joy.
I'm going to cut you off because I have to.
Yes.
Because the listeners don't know you so well yet.
That's fair enough. So
nobody cares more, does more work tracking, compiling video highlights of, and ensuring that a big deal is made of Olympico goals anywhere in the world than Marissa Lordanic.
It's a passion. I love it so much. It's become a bit of a joke, really, honestly. I didn't think it was going to become a core part of my personality online, but it has. So we love an Olympico, have always loved Olympicos. Will say, considering the audience here, that Megan Rapinoe's Olympico in the bronze medal match at the Olympics hurt me very deeply. I was like, how could something I love so much betray me in this moment when I really, so but that's unimportant. Kyra Cooney-Cross, excellent player. And we've learned now that she can really kind of do a job across the midfield, which is very exciting. She's only a year or so older than Fowler, but still needs a little bit of time, I reckon, to kind of work into senior women's international football. But what she can do as an attacking player, we know that she has everything in her kit bag in terms of a passing range, in terms of scoring ability. She's got the works, and then all of that kind of does translate in a way to being more of an 8 or a 6 in the midfield. So she has a really important role to play, I think, in the future of this team across the midfield. We don't know exactly where, but I think it's exciting that she can do things and do things well in whatever kind of position is needed. Another young player, I suppose, that we've really kind of seen a lot of recently, Courtney Nevin, the 19-year-old that was in the heart of defence in Sydney and then retained her spot for the Newcastle game as well. She's nominally a fullback, so the fact that she is playing in the heart of the defence is interesting, but to her immense credit, she's done really well. She's shown a lot of character. She's shown a lot of good kind of defensive know-how, and she has an absolutely cracking left foot. So we saw a little bit that she can pass out from the back. She can pick that player. She can do the long ball. And it's really exciting that we may potentially have a question, or an answer rather, to this question about who is going to partner Alana Kennedy in the centre of the Australian defence, because it's been an issue for years and has yet to turn up an answer. So the fact that Nevin seems to be emerging as the answer, or at least part of that conversation that's worth taking note of, is very, very exciting. it would be remiss of me to not mention a player who isn't exactly young. She's about 23, 24, but Claire Wheeler is another player who has emerged in this kind of last year as someone who could be really, really important for the Matildas. She's one of Sam, my podcast mate's favourite players, has a very strong sense of ownership over Claire Wheeler and Claire Wheeler doing well. But again, an excellent six, which is another area of the Matildas kind of lineup that's been a bit interesting, patchy. We have one excellent player, but unfortunately she's had the most torrid run of injuries of late, so we haven't gotten to see her a lot. So Claire Wheeler is another one who could end up being really, 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 really important for this Matildas team in the long term. But it's exciting that we have these new players to talk about, because we've had this kind of core group of players who are still very much within a good age range and can hopefully do big things in the next couple of years. But to see that they're now being supported by a younger cast is very exciting, looking kind of long term for the Matildas.
Claire Wheeler plays for Fortuna Hjørring, for folks
She
who
does.
don't know, club-wise in Denmark. Courtney Nevin and Kyra Cooney-Cross play for
Melbourne Victory here in the A-League Women's.
a team you know a little about, I believe.
I'm familiar with them. I did not
Yes.
wear their kit today, but
You watch a lot of their games, as the saying goes.
Yes, very much. So it helps that they're in the right city.
I asked the point about Cooney-Cross and Nevin because we have, obviously the pipeline is open now for Australian players to go to Europe, to England in particular, to the NWSL every once in a while. Do you think that we will soon see those two make the jump? Because the W League, more money, commercial money, fan ticket revenues, et cetera, interest keeps coming into it. They want to be one of the bigger professional women's leagues in the world, and they are, by default, is a little bit of, I don't quite mean it that way, but there's just not so many of them that are such big deals at this point. But the W League is certainly one. The WE League in Japan is going to start making a charge here. We know that. So there's going to be competition for these players. Do you think that they're going to end up going abroad here at some point?
Yeah, they have to. I think we all know that, because for all of the good things that the A-League women's competition has, and it has so much good history. It's been an excellent league for so long. It's been the kind of development ground for so many excellent players, and it's so important and does a lot of things right. The fact of the matter is, players can play 14 games here, and that's just not enough football. That's not enough football for anyone. So unfortunately, players need to go abroad if they want to actually make a serious run at things. In an ideal world, the season is longer, and not only does that mean that we can keep players here and attract other international talent, but I think the fact of the matter is, if, for example, an example is Emily Van Egmond has obviously her rights are with Orlando. Your system confuses me with the NWSL.
She just left though, did she?
Yes, but I think Orlando retains her rights and whatever.
I can go off on that for a long time. The rule is awful. They took it from the men's league here about right of first refusal on returning to the league. It's outrageous. I've complained about it on the men's side for close to 20 years, and I've complained about it on the women's side from the moment the women's league started copying it. No, it's terrible, but she's going to go play in Newcastle, right?
Yes. So we've got her in Australia for at least a month. Obviously, then the Matildas will take part in the Asian Cup early January. So it's a very short-term kind of deal. In an ideal world, we get Emily Van Egmond signing for Newcastle, and there isn't a sense of, she's only playing at Newcastle. In an ideal world, the W League is at a high enough level that everyone can kind of think to themselves, all right, it's not maybe the best possible environment for her, but we know that as Australian football, we are doing everything we possibly can to ensure a high level of football. And this isn't a knock on the Jets at all. They're a great side, but there's just so much more that we as Australian football could do to ensure that every kind of possible option or every kind of avenue is explored in order to make sure that we are giving the women the best possible competition for them to play in here, if that's what they so happen to do. And it's the same with Cooney Cross and Nevin. In an ideal world, they're already off in Europe and following the likes of Claire Wheeler. There's about 4 Aussies in Denmark. There's a lot of girls in Sweden. Obviously, all the big name Matildas are in England and stuff. In an ideal world, they're already in Europe, but not going to knock them for wanting to stay home for another season, especially in COVID times, not wanting to travel, potentially get stuck places, all of that jazz. But ideally, they're playing in a competition that at least gets them, 20 games of football. That changes the whole conversation. Ideally, they're not playing alongside players who are also juggling other jobs, part-time work, things of that nature. So my point has always been players should be playing in the best leagues available to them, but I don't think the Australian League is doing enough to ensure that we are providing the best possible environment that we can for these players.
So I misspoke in calling it the W League, which I realized after I said it.
Changed its name. That's a fun topic of conversation as well, but we won't go into
it's suffice to say they attempted to do it in the name of gender equality, and it did not quite work.
It's sorted itself out now, but there was a good little while where all of a sudden the men's was dropped from the men's league, and it was like, yes. I'm shocked that this has happened.
Right. I followed your show for a long time, as you know, and a long ways back, you took an email from a listener who asked why there was an exodus of Australian players from the NWSL to England specifically, and whether people in certain positions of influence in Australian football, never mind the players themselves, I'm talking about other folks, benefit perhaps financially from those players being in England specifically, and the big brands that are associated with them that are very popular in England. Why I asked such a snide question back then? Gosh, why would I do that? I'm sure you remember. It was almost probably a year and a half ago at this point that I sent that over. But no, I in some amount of fun, but also in some serious, asked the Far Post crew if they'd ponder that on the show. And it was rightly said, no, it's not really that. But Sam wrote about it at one point. I remember reading about it. There's something about seeing Australians play for Arsenal, Chelsea, West Ham, Manchester City, etc. And it was the same when Sam Mewis went to City and Alex Morgan to Spurs, which they made an enormous amount of money from at Tottenham, even though she played 2 games, whatever it was for them. We go jumping into the mud on this show on a fairly regular basis. I am occasionally more conspiratorial than I should be, and then I get told to cool it and I'm wrong, and I accept that I'm wrong. But is there something to be gained commercially from certain influencers and so on from the fact that they go to these big English teams specifically?
It's a question. I can't even wrap my head around it, but I will say, so the examples that you use then of your Sam Mewis's and your Alex Morgans, what's the difference between those two and your Sam Kerrs and your Caitlin Fords, for example? Well, some of them are still in the league. Some of them were there for half a season. And then
most of the Americans, Tobin Heath obviously being an exception, most of them, although she has this Louisville situation, most of the Americans that went there during the pandemic when the NWSL had stopped playing games of consequence and then came back. But there was and part of this Australian exodus happened at the same time, but it was also already starting. And I almost take her out of the equation in a way because the money involved with her was on a completely different scale than any of the rest of this. And yes, a number of us would like to see some of these Australian players come back and play in the NWSL because they were very good. There is a core of people here in the U.S. who watches the W League and have been complaining on Twitter, as I'm sure you've seen, about how hard it is to find the games up here because there's no TV deal. They're on YouTube is the answer. If you go on the W League's website, there's some information about that. But the part of the question too is, we have a complex about English football in this country too, as I'm sure you were well aware. The English Premier League is the most popular English-speaking men's soccer league in the United States. For folks who don't know, the Mexican men's league is the most popular soccer league overall because of the huge Mexican immigrant population in this country. There is absolutely a complex here about the brand power of the English clubs and how they gained commercially from it when American players have gone over there for some time now, not just the pandemic era, but before then, and how the English clubs benefit financially and expand their brand influence in Australia that they already have. When Manchester United, when Arsenal, when Liverpool, when Chelsea, and Man City on the men's side go down there and sell out the Melbourne Cricket Ground. We all know it. The Australians are especially good at telling the Brits to get out of town, which I will again allude. We're going to get to the cricket analogy in the next segment because of that. But the Australians are especially good at telling the Brits to get out of town. They've been doing it for 200 years or whatever it is, as have the U.S. to varying degrees of success. Is there any of that dynamic in terms of, hey, we're trying to build our own league over here and make it even bigger?
I think that's the thing. So the competition here resigned seems like too strong a word, but my brain isn't working fast enough to think of another one. So seems resigned to being a development league because it's unwilling to put in the work in order to compete with your WSL types. And even to an extent with the NWSL, like I know for all of the problems, the No More Side Hustles initiative and stuff, for all of the kind of issues with the NWSL, the end of the day, you guys are playing more games than us, and it's more teams. There's just kind of more. Ideally, some more money as well for these players. So I think it goes back to my point about what the women's league here offers versus what other competitions offer, and it's not so much applying men's narratives to the women's league. It's more about the actual kind of realities of trying to play women's football in Australia versus somewhere like England, where you've got a full season, the potential for cup competitions, the potential for European competition. You have a stable salary. You have, heaps of games, but not too many. There was a point in time where, Alana Kennedy was playing full W League, full NWSL, plus Matilda's games. She was racking up, I think, the most minutes of any women's footballer in the world. And it was to a detriment to a lot of these players. They were burnt out. They were getting injured. It was a nightmare, to be honest. So I think for all the kind of conspiracy and whatever you like, I think ultimately the move to England makes sense for a lot of these players purely as footballers and what they can get from being in one city, from not having to kind of do the juggle of multiple leagues. And just, it is a high competition, especially for the likes of the players that are playing in Europe and going on deep cup runs, whether that be the Conti Cup or the FA Cup.
So before we get to my next question that I've been teasing repeatedly here, we're going to take a quick commercial break and sell some ads for the benefit of my producer, Kevin Laramie, up in Montreal. Of course, we'll remind you all that if you do not subscribe to the Sports Podcasting Network's Patreon, give it a shot. Maybe give it a little of your money. I know how much Kevin and Dwayne Rollins appreciate it, especially right now with so much going on in the Canadian soccer world and the potential for me to be paying them a visit next month for reasons on the men's side that I'm sure those of you who follow American men's soccer have also heard about. We'll take a quick break. We'll be right back here on the Women's Soccer Review on the Sports Podcasting Network. Welcome back to the Women's Soccer Review here on the Sports Podcasting Network. I'm Jonathan Tannenwald of the Philadelphia Inquirer. So thrilled to be joined by my friend Marissa Lordanic of ESPN. Before we get into the less serious stuff, I realized I have one other serious question to ask regarding the competition between the various domestic leagues around the world for talent and where the A-League women fits into that. And that is, as Japan starts putting what looks like it's going to be a significant investment into the WE League to not only develop Japanese players, but go out and get not the top American or European players, but significant players from other countries who would like to have the opportunity to play in Japan. Do you think that is going to have an impact on the W League, and if so, how?
I do think as the WE League kind of grows and establishes itself, that it's definitely going to be a competition in competition with the A-League women's, because again, it's a fully professional league. Japanese football, very good. Why wouldn't you want to go play with some of the most technical players in the world? Like, it's a no-brainer. The A, like I said, I feel like I'm just repeating myself, but the A-League women obviously has its advantages, and it's terrible to say, but we do have the advantage of being a lovely place to live. The lifestyle factor of Australia never really goes astray. To be fair, though, Japan, also a lovely place. So it's not.
And that's been part of the appeal of the US too for all these years.
Exactly. So I think the people who do still want to come to Australia or are hell-bent on going to an English-speaking country specifically, they will continue to come here. They'll continue to find a way. But in terms of just like maybe on paper comparing what the A-League women's can offer versus what the WE League can offer, why wouldn't you go to the fully professional competition? That seems like a no-brainer to me. So I think, again, it's more a question of the A-League women's catching up and ensuring that it continues to put its best foot forward to encourage players to come down under. But I do think we will see more and more players go to the A-League women's, the WE League. We had a player in the WE League, Alex Chidiak, but she's moved back home on a loan deal to play with Melbourne Victory for this season. But it's only one season. It's only been one, or not even one season yet. So I do think that we are going to see more of Japan, and they are going to become a bigger player in this kind of market, especially if, as you said, that money comes rolling in, because it helps. You never sniff your nose at a bit of investment.
And, you are having Lynn Williams down there, if only for a short amount of time, which is going to be pretty neat and good for her to be able to spend some time with her boyfriend, who she has not been able to see for quite a while because of the pandemic, who was based in Australia. And with that, we will start to get to some of the less serious things that Marissa and I spend a lot of time bantering about on Twitter DMs and Instagram DMs and whatnot. And I will begin with the use of some props. On the television to my right is a sports team that has given me so much angst. Two of them, in fact, that have given me so much angst for some years now. One of them, which because it wins, and the other because it loses to the team that beats it on a regular basis. I have in my right hand a Duke and Sung Special County Test cricket ball, and in my left hand, representing Marissa's home country, a Kookaburra Turf red Test cricket ball. The Ashes in men's cricket are going on right now. They are, of course, on in Australia. For those of you who don't know, it is the great cricket rivalry between Australia and England, the second best rivalry in international cricket behind India and Pakistan, which is always for all the marbles. The Ashes are being played not literally played as we record. They are on a lunch break right now, but they are in the midst of the first Test match in Perth, where England, the team that I support in the classic bandwagoning fashion, gets crushed every single time by Australia, or so it feels. And the reason why Australian men's cricket has anything to do with Australian women's soccer is because of a player who we have in fact discussed very little on this show so far. One which you're not supposed to mention on any show again about the NWSL anymore, and yet we all do it every time anyway, and that is Sam Kirk. And here is why. You all know that I strongly defend the right of American women's soccer players to have big egos. And when the rest of the world pokes a stick at the Americans and complains about how egotistical and arrogant and so on they are, those of us in the U.S. said, would you please go out and beat them and then feel free to dunk on us when you do. And when Canada beat the U.S. in the Olympics, the Canadians, who more than any other country in the world detest the arrogance of American women's soccer players, I turned around to my Canadian friends and said, dunk on me, please, let it out. Let me have it. However, there is one country in international women's football where this is unquestionably not a problem, and it is Australia. Because sporting arrogance is essential to the Australian culture. No team in Australia, and specifically New Zealand, it's the men's rugby team. In Australia, at least for some of us, no team is more famous for its arrogance on the men's side than the national men's cricket team. It has been their brand for decades. And whenever they play England, look up the name Shane Warne, folks, for those of you who have not heard of it. And you'll quickly find other examples too. They trash talk the English out in the middle of the field from the start of play in the morning until the end of play at night. And sometimes they get in trouble for it. And sometimes the English media, the older ones in particular, like to tut them. And every once in a blue moon, the English go out and beat them. And the Australians even sometimes admit it when they get beat. But this is the point. Sam Kerr's arrogant. I don't personally think that she's the best women's soccer player in the world. I am still waiting for her to win a really big medal with Australia at a major women's international tournament, as I know you are too. And cover your ears for a minute. I still remember because I was on the Fox set in Paris when it happened. They had a few of us over that night to watch the end. You know where I'm going too, I think. I can tell because I'm looking at you on Zoom. Australia, Norway, Sam Kerr stepped to the spot, and everybody watching knew as she was walking up that she was going to miss it because you could tell, and she missed it. But she is arrogant, and I am here for it. And if I were a Chelsea fan, which everybody knows I'm not, I would be especially here for it. What is the reception like in Australia to Sam Kerr, and particularly her, but she's not the only one, to the Australian women's soccer team having arrogance? Because arrogance is such a big part of the Australian sporting culture on the men's side and has been for so long.
See, this is really interesting. I feel like I am getting the outsider's perspective on how we are viewed. I think your takes on the men's cricket team spot on. Like no one likes the men's cricket team. And to be fair, they don't cover themselves in glory often. There are many incidents where they are simply no good.
They just happen to beat England a lot because England's worse, which excuses a lot of it.
It's one of those things where it's like, you're good on the field, but at what cost? You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah.
It's that separating like the actual way they kind of present themselves versus the way they actually go about their particular sport. Hearing you kind of describe Kerr as arrogant is super fascinating to me, because I definitely do not think that that's how folks here would view her, barring maybe the select few that don't like how she goes about certain things. I think we need to mention what happened the other day where she's literally, but maybe, people would have seen that and been like, oh, I just don't like that about her. That's just, no good. So to hear you kind of describe her as arrogant, I certainly don't think of her as arrogant. I think, but in a way, I can see how you maybe come to that conclusion. I'm thinking
but it's not an insult; it's a compliment.
No, I know. From chatting to you, I know that you definitely mean it as a compliment. The kind of main example that I'm thinking of at the moment, which is maybe kind of off topic or not correct, but just her tweet after the Barcelona-Lyon Women's Champions League final, where she was just like, and this is meant to be competitive, and people kind of jumped on her for that. So that's maybe like related but not completely connected to her arrogance. I think she knows she's good, and she is. But for me, it doesn't come across as arrogance, because particularly in Australian culture, and particularly in Australian sporting culture, we've got tall poppy syndrome, where we cut down people who think a bit too highly of themselves. So I think it's very natural for a lot of Australian sports people to kind of toe the line in the sense of, oh, I'm just doing my bit for the team, or to kind of carry that underdog title as well. So I don't know, it's a weird one. Kerr's also, it's fascinating in the sense that we don't produce global superstars. There is obviously exceptions, and there's your Olympic athletes, which are then a whole other kettle of fish. But in terms of sports people who actually make a name for themselves on a global scale, there's not a lot, because at the end of the day, we're an island, a giant island nowhere near anyone else. So a lot of our kind of big sports stars play sports that are only played here, or only played in former British colonies. Like, yeah. we don't have, I suppose, a lot of cut through into the global markets. The kind of obvious examples at the moment that I'm thinking of are Kerr and Ash Barty, the tennis player. Like, they are genuine global superstars. And I think if you asked any average Australian, they would be like, no, they're lovely girls. They're humble. They go about their respective sports, and they do good things. So yeah, I find, the tag of arrogance for Kerr, I don't know, maybe I have Kerr tinted glasses on, I don't know, but it's definitely not an adjective I would use to describe her, and I don't think a lot of people here would.
It's fascinating to hear that, because I am certain that a lot of Americans would and do. And are happy to do so, and are happy to send Krista Mewis cavorting after her to distract her. No, look, this is that's snide. I wish the two of them all the best of times together. And if by the time we've posted this show online, Krista Mewis has signed for some team in London, I don't think any of us would be surprised at this point. Maybe not. I don't know. I don't actually know whether it's going to happen. I just wouldn't be surprised at this point. Mm-hmm. Maybe not Chelsea specifically, but some other team in London. When Sam Kerr uttered the 7 technically, but for the U.S. it was 5 most famous words that she's ever said on an international stage. Kevin, our producer, might bleep me. One of the words I'm not allowed to write in my newspaper. I have to put it in brackets and say stinks instead of the word that she used.
Okay.
For those of you who are so new to women's soccer that you don't know what it is, when Australia beat Brazil at the 2019 World Cup, Sam Kerr said, "We're back, so suck on that one." And she received a standing ovation here in the United States for saying that. And again, she was playing over here, had been playing over here for some time. We already knew about her goal-scoring exploits, the backflips, everything else. And I know it caused a stir in Australia. And again, my reaction to that, and of course I'm not surprised to hear professional women's soccer players get treated by domestic media, fans, etc., as the girl next door. Alex Morgan's been treated as the girl next door by the American media for a long time. She's got an enormous ego. She doesn't present it when she goes on Good Morning America and talks politely about the equal pay lawsuits and whatnot. But she's got an enormous ego. She would not be Alex Morgan, prolific goal scorer for the most decorated, talented, and deep of player pool women's soccer team on the planet, because you don't get to the level. I've said this a million times. You know this as well as anybody. You don't get to the level that Alex Morgan is at and that Sam Kerr is at without crushing people along the way, including pitch invaders, as we have seen in the last. But that you have to be that way to be a professional athlete. And it's always interesting, of course, to have outsiders' perspectives of America reflected back on me and here in the United States, as we did at the start of the show, and now reflect some outside perspectives of Australia back onto you all. Again, I don't know as much. I have not been down there yet. I'd love to go someday. It's such a haul for folks in the U.S. to do. If you're going to do it from up here, you've got to do it for like 2 or 3 weeks to deal with the jet lag, to spend enough time in Melbourne, enough time in Sydney, go out elsewhere in the country to see, the rural and natural areas and all whatnot. You've got to do it's a lot of time and a lot of money. You do it once in your life, probably, and it's a lifetime memory. But for me, who sees part of how my lens toward Australia is through international sport and through cricket in particular, a little through rugby, but less so, a little through Aussie rules football, where there's plenty of arrogance in that sport. I'm well aware, having read your newspapers enough over time. I would have thought that a little arrogance in women's soccer would be, this is part of who we are. Now, if they were to beat England in a major international tournament, maybe that would really be when it comes out among the populace and the media and whatnot, because that's how you really get everybody down there riled up.
Well, the win against Team GB in the Olympics kind of acted as that sort of thing. I think the issue here is, or where we're coming at, maybe like the point of contention is just how we label her behavior, and maybe then the connotations associated with certain words. So like, you use arrogance as a compliment, and I think a lot of people would, because they like that bravado, they like that cockiness, they think it's good. Where I think the point of contention here in Australia would be that arrogance is bad, negative. You do not say that in a complimentary way to someone, where we would look at it as the concept of the battler, of the underdog mentality of the little guy beating up on the big guy, an element of larrikinism as well, I suppose, of just being very kind of brash but casual, but again coming from it's confidence in oneself and a kind of I'm saying a lot of words, but I'm not saying a lot, you know what I mean? So her comment after the Brazil game here, I think for the most part, barring some older folks who maybe took offense to it, but the general kind of consensus here was like, heck yeah, you tell them. Like, it was, but not perceived as arrogance. It was, she told them what to do and cast aside anyone who doubted them, anything like that. I really think the point of contention comes from how we individually interpret the word arrogance. We would never call her arrogant here, but we would, if you said the definition without the word, I reckon we would probably agree on it. But the actual word itself is where there's the disconnect.
Right. No, that's very interesting. And a subject for a continued discussion down the road, especially when the World Cup comes around in 2023, because part of this is how you market female athletes and making them into the kind of big stars that the Matildas are now, and Kerr in particular, getting to come back to Australia and play in front of a big crowd and be what we would say in capital letters, a big deal. And I know how much work was put in. I know how much work Sam Kerr has put in for a long time in her career to make that happen. And it was great, even for us who were worried about what was going to happen to the U.S. team, but it was just great to see it be a big deal. In the stands, in the newspapers, such as anybody reads newspapers anymore, said the guy who still writes for one, et cetera, and so on. And I would, you certainly welcome to talk about this. It sure looked from up here, but I'm sure it was down there. It was a big deal.
Yeah, it was, and it was billed as such. Like, there was a lot of interest generated, and it has continued to bubble along because, things like this don't happen here. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's not something we get every day. With COVID, this was only the team's second time playing back in Australia in about 18 months, and it was billed as the dress rehearsal for the World Cup. Come break this record with us for the attendance. Come see this team. Come, let's do it. Because also the COVID restrictions here had kind of eased a little bit, which allowed us to have even more people in the stadium. So the last kind of two series of friendlies that the Matildas have played against Brazil and against the US have been billed as big deals because they have been. They've been really important. Obviously, the Brazil friendlies benefit from the amazing rivalry between the teams and whatever, but the US as well. You never turn down the opportunity to see the US here. They don't come here. No, they don't go anywhere, really. Let's be honest there. So it was a big deal, and it was important.
They're getting better at going on the road. They try to do one big road trip a year now outside of a major tournament. They do play a lot of home games, and people, I think the core fan base, the people who really treat it as a sports team, are happy to see them go on the road and really get tested in Europe and Australia. It was the first time in 21 years that they'd been to Australia. It was obviously in preparation for the World Cup in 23. I think there was also some, hey, we are two national FAs that get along on a lot of things, and we're going to help you get to 23 World Cup if you might put in a good word about a few other things that we're trying to do up here. The 26 Men's World Cup was one of them. The 27, or more likely probably 31, but 27 would be pretty cool too. Women's World Cup being here in the U.S. might be a little something that got talked about. And you and I both know that because we know some of the people who were in those rooms. And I think it was all it was for the betterment of everybody that this happened. And I'm glad it did. I'm glad that the protocols were able to be worked out in the way that they were to make it happen. Because we didn't know until almost the start of November that it was actually going to come off. I was at Carly Lloyd's national team finale in October, and they weren't 100. They were optimistic that it was going to happen, but they weren't 100% certain until end of October, early November that it was going to happen. So I'm glad it did. And now we are going to take a very dramatic, wild left turn on this show because it is just about the holiday season. It is finally, after the NWSL drafts are over, going to be the time of year when we can finally slow down and breathe a little bit. And if you're wondering what the hell we're about to talk about, we're going to do a little reminiscing about the 2019 Women's World Cup, because that is where I first met Marissa and Anna Harrington and a number of their past and present colleagues who may or may not end up listening to this show, including two of the greatest people I have ever met in international soccer, Anne O'Dong and Moya Dodd, who have done so very much for Australian women's soccer for such a long time. And Marissa and I are going to talk about our mutual interest in French culture and the city where we met, which was Grenoble, for one of what is still one of my favorite women's soccer games I have ever been to. Admittedly, not because of Australia and the Australian team I was there partly to cover. That was when the greatly missed website Pro Soccer USA was still alive and made its greatest journalistic accomplishment, which was coverage of that World Cup on every level, not just the United States, but players from teams all over the tournament who were in the NWSL and players who American fans wanted to read about, not just on the U.S. team and the teams that were playing. So I was over there for 2 weeks helping with Pro Soccer USA's coverage, and I went down to Grenoble for Australia, Jamaica. And was rewarded with just the privilege of a lifetime of seeing Jamaica score its first goal in the Women's World Cup. It remains one of the great things I've ever seen in person in international soccer. You could have powered the aerial tram that runs across the Yser River in the middle of downtown from the electricity in that stadium when that ball went in the net. Obviously, Australia went on to win 4-1, so it was fine, for you, Marissa, and everybody else who was there to cover Australia. But what Marissa and I have done on just about every month or two since then is post a raft of photos of us on Instagram of our memories of being there, because it's just the best country. With all due respect to Australia, it's just the best country to go visit, isn't it?
I love France. I could talk about France all the time. My friends regularly make fun of me for bringing up France, and then I like to flip my hair and be like, I don't know if you guys know, but I went to France once. And they're like, no, did you? You never mention it ever. So that's become a long running joke. Lots of people love to tease me about it, but it was the best. It was just the best trip. I will admit, I have a France tattoo that I got after the World Cup. It was about a year after the World Cup because of COVID and whatnot, but I did because it was just the best trip as a whole, and the best trip for me. It was my first time going overseas, so I didn't know that. I'd never been overseas before, and I decided I'm going to go to a World Cup and it's going to be great. And I got to do so many cool things as a fan, and then so many cool things as someone who was still very, very new and very, very inexperienced in a journalism sense. So it was just the absolute best trip, and I will take any and every opportunity to talk about it. So I'm stoked that we're going to get into it.
I was supposed to go at the end of this month. As folks here know, I was going to do a week in London and a week in Paris, see some games, see a lot of friends, eat the very best food on the planet. I mean, it just is. You cannot, if there is a bad meal in France, I mean, certainly no American tourist who would go there would think of it. But I wish for you to someday come to America and experience a supermarket chain here that we have called Trader Joe's, which has the best cheap cheese aisle of any supermarket chain in the country. So you can get all manner of great French cheeses. And I, on top of, if I want to get the really expensive ones, I can do that too. Because living on the East Coast of the US, there are specialty stores, or, New York, the legendary Murray's Cheeses in New York is an hour away if I really want to spend an exorbitant amount of money on cheese. But usually with Trader Joe's, I don't have to, because I can get all the good stuff for like a third of the price from them. And there are a couple of really good French restaurants near where I live here. And it's for people who didn't get to go. For you as an Australian being there that day, seeing so much green and gold around town, and how much went to Montpellier, which is another one of my favorite cities in France, and the other cities where Australia played in that tournament. What was that like?
It was, so in the lead up to going to the World Cup, I was very nervous because of who I am as a person, but so many people said, no, other Aussies will be there and you will be fine. And I'll never forget, so our first game was against Italy in Valenciennes. And so I've caught the bus from Lille to Valenciennes, and we've walked into the centre of this very sleepy town. And all of a sudden you just see green and gold jerseys. And for those who do remember the 2019 Matildas kits, they were not subtle. They were not.
No, they weren't.
They were. You could not miss them. And we were all there in these incredibly loud yellow and green shirts. And you would walk down the street and there would just be that nod of acknowledgement, or the smile of like, we're here on the other side of the world for the same reason. And that's incredible. So the walk into the stadium on that day was just one of the most unbelievable things. You walk into the stadium up there, excellent, very, very good. And just seeing, again, those pockets of green and gold, it's not something you forget. And it does make you kind of think about how, the largeness of the world and the smallness of it, that we were all there. literally on the other side of the world, to watch a team kick a ball around. Like, if we're going to go real surface level, what we're doing over there, we've traveled hundreds of kilometers to go see some people kick a ball around, and it was the best. Obviously, that result was not my personal favorite. We lost 2-1. I saw some people after the game, and one guy was like, "You look really sad. You look really dejected." And I'm like, yeah, because I've just spent like 6 months, everyone hyping me up saying, "You're going to a World Cup. You're going to have the best time. You're going to have so much fun." No one reminded me that we could actually lose games and it would actually really hurt, because it's a major tournament and all of these losses mean things. But no, just being surrounded by other people who cared that much about women's football to fork out the money to go to France, unbelievable. The day in Montpellier, the miracle of Montpellier, as we like to call it, where we've come back against Brazil, that was an unbelievable game. That is one of my favorite ever games that I've ever attended, that I've ever watched. It was everything that you wanted in a Matildas game, or everything that you expected from them, from, you know, the comeback win to the opposition to just the way everything kind of happened. I maintain it's the only good use of VAR in the history of football. Otherwise, I don't want a bar of it, but they can keep that one specific use of VAR. But yeah, just France was so incredible. And I think with hindsight now, it becomes even more incredible considering the pandemic and how distant things like that have become, and how far away they feel, and how, you know, 2023 is not that far away, but there's still an element of, are we actually going to get to do this? I really, really hope that everyone can come here and hang out and watch some excellent football and whatnot. But yeah, France has kind of almost taken on a mythical sort of glow, not only from being an excellent tournament at the time, but just from what followed it and made it seem even bigger and grander than maybe it even was.
It was one of the last major international sports events that had that much global travel before the pandemic started. And some folks, you know, some listeners know, for those who don't, I only did the middle 2 weeks of the tournament because of a story about my job situation at the time that I will tell someday after either I have retired or everybody else on the planet is dead or something. I don't know. I can't tell it now for obvious reasons because it pertains to my current employer. I had wanted for ever since the 1998 Men's World Cup to go see a game at Montpellier at that stadium, because it's a completely different stadium than anything we're used to, and architecturally than anything we're used to in the United States. It's got 3 covered stands, all 1960s era concrete, and one giant stand on one side that goes about 4 levels up. And even for French Ligue 1 men's games, the top 3 tiers of it are tarped off because the stadium's so old. I don't know whether they might untarp them once, like the last game they ever play there, because I know they're talking about building a new stadium there. But I got to see Italy, China in that building, which was Italy's first win in a Women's World Cup knockout round game, I believe. It was either that or their first time going to a quarterfinal, or possibly both. I forget which, but that was loads of fun. We've had Daniela Porcelli, who's, of course, the famous photographer based in Switzerland, who's half Italian, half Swiss. She's been on this show. We've reminisced about it before. You can go back in the show's archives and listen to that. When I was planning out trying to get over there, you'd said to me, you're going to cover the U.S. team the whole time. Fine. I will cover the U.S. team the whole time. Give me one game to go to outside of like if I'm in Paris for 5 days and there's a game in Paris that night, let me go. Sure. Let me go out of the way of the U.S. beat for one game. And I said this months before the tournament. It was Australia, Brazil. Because U.S. fans know so many players on both sides in that game, not just Sam Kerr and Marta and Debinha, but so many others. And Formiga, too, whose international career, as we know, just came to an end. But you mentioned, you got to go to some of the U.S. games, right? Is my memory right on that?
I did not go.
You did.
I didn't. I think Sam went to a couple. She went to the game against France from memory. I didn't get to see a US
Anne
game.
O'Dong was at that, and she was. I'm sure some of you know who Anne O'Dong is. She used to be a journalist. She's now an official with the Australian FA and the World Cup organizing effort. And she was a FIFA suit, literally had the FIFA suit at the World Cup in 2019. We gave her no end of grief for it, which she gladly took because she understood how crazy it was. She was at USA France. I was at USA France. I was at USA Chile as well. A number of listeners know, and Marissa, you know, I've been a PSG fan for 20 plus years. The Parc des Princes is my favorite currently standing stadium in Europe. Highbury was the original Highbury. London was the other one. To see my country play in my favorite stadium in Europe. I mean, USA France was the game of the tournament. One of the truly greatest games in international women's soccer history. We all know that. The thing about USA Chile, I flew to Paris 2 days before it. In fact, I landed at de Gaulle, dropped my stuff at my hotel, and went straight into the city to the day before press conference. We all know, everybody who listens to the show, no matter where in the world you're listening from, even if you're listening, we have one listener in Japan, Dan Orlowitz of the Japan Times, who you know, because he's been on your show before. I wanted to make sure to give him a shout out somewhere here because he actually just came back to the States for vacation right now. I'm going to see him in a week and a half, which he's from Philly. I don't know if you know that. So I'm going to see him. He's going to be home in a week and a half, and a bunch of us are going to have a big party with him. He's bringing us all lots of souvenirs and J-League soccer team jerseys and stuff like that. We're all used to U.S. fans traveling in enormous hordes for men's and women's tournaments, for men's and women's national team games, obviously for the 2015 World Cup, which was in Canada, which made it very easy to do. To be in Paris, to see, I'm sure you saw the videos of the American Outlaws marching through the streets. To be in Paris, to see so many of my friends over there from all over the United States, to be sitting in the Parc des Princes with 40,000+ other American soccer fans who had written their summer vacation schedules, or it was Father's Day, actually, it was U.S. Father's Day. It was a Sunday game. So many people who I know, even casual soccer fans, had planned their summer vacations around being in Paris that weekend. It's one thing to do it in Canada. It's one thing to travel across the United States. But I knew, and everybody knew, that was really exceptional to see that. And to almost forget for a moment that you were thousands of miles from home at the most expensive time of the year to go to France, which it is. It was really extraordinary. And I saw Australia jerseys all over the country, everywhere I went, even on days when Australia wasn't playing, as U.S. fans would too. I saw U.S. fans who I knew from Twitter in Grenoble on the day of the Australia-Jamaica game. They had gone to it. Both of our countries have travel baked into us. As isolationist as we can also be, both of our countries, especially among our soccer fans, have travel baked into us. It is something that I dearly miss, and I know you and all your colleagues down there do too. And one of these years, Australia will play over here, and y'all will get to come over, and we will all show you around and have a grand old time. Anything that I should have mentioned and forgot, or what else that you want to close out with, or tout your own stuff, or whatever you want to do?
Oh God, no, I think we've covered a heap, a long heap. But I will say, just to your point about the excitement of, seeing the US in Paris, I think for Australia, it's kind of the opposite in regards to the 23 World Cup, just that everyone's going to come here.
Yeah.
And that is such a novelty because no one comes here. We're so far away. We know we're so far away. So the fact that people will have to come here, that is the most exciting thing. That is what I cannot wait to see, ideally, if we're talking about, Stadium Australia in Sydney, 80,000 people in this stand watching women's football in Australia. That moment is going to absolutely blow my mind, and I cannot wait for it. As much as the excitement of, being overseas and being far from home is incredible, and I can only imagine how amazing it was for you in Paris that night, that just because of where we are and who we are, to have everyone here is going to be just unbelievable, to know that everyone made that trip and came down and supported women's football in that way. So I cannot wait for that moment of just absolutely full stands, ideally with as many different jerseys as you can possibly imagine, and just we're all there watching women's football. I cannot wait for it. And
if you see a Philadelphia Union hat in the press box, it will probably belong to Dan Orlowitz. He wears it he wore it. He NBC's sideline reporter for the women's football at the Olympics, who also is the sideline reporter for the national NWSL broadcasts up here, Marissa Pilla, is from. If you're listening, Marissa, she was on the show a while back, but she currently lives about a mile and a half from me, and she's moving out to the suburbs. I almost called her a traitor. I'm not going to do it. She knows that she's from here. She knows all that dynamic. Look, this has been so much fun. Thank you for the time. We've been on for a while. I realize this is a long show, but it's the holiday season. As I said, we've got a little time. We wanted to just sit back and enjoy it and chat for a while and have some fun, because God knows it's going to be a long time before we see each other in person again, which is a shame. I wish you all could come up here for a little while and see the place, but we'll probably have to wait until 23, and I don't even want to think about how much money it's going to cost for us to go, but I know how many people are going to do it, and it's going to be a lot of people, probably even more people than I thought it was going to be in 2019, but it's going to be quite a show. Marissa Lordanic is on Twitter, if I may say so, at Marissa Lordanic. Well, you've got the show on your phone. You can see how her name is spelled. You can figure out what her Twitter handle is. The show is the Far Post Pod on Twitter, and you can go to the rest from there. And you can pick a side between Sydney and Melbourne, but it better be Melbourne. How's that for an answer?
Love it. Support it.
For Marissa Lordanic of ESPN, this is Jonathan Tannenwald of the Philadelphia Inquirer. Thank you all so much for taking the time and for listening to this latest episode of the Women's Soccer Review here on the Sports Podcasting Network.